the questions that we talk about a lot, and I actually posted a short article on LinkedIn a little while ago, is we still see a lot of use of the chasing arrows symbols. And we in the plastics industry should know better here. That is not the resin identification code, right? ASTM changed that to solid triangle several years ago. Even though there was no enforcement mechanism for molders and processors to change any of their molds away from chasing arrows to the solid triangle. So it still creates quite a bit of confusion, I would say. And I'd love to get some thoughts from other people on that as to what can we do as individuals here or members of our companies to really sort of have a grassroots level change that forces people to really question their assumptions on some of these symbolic elements in sustainability.
That's a good point, Conor. You know, as we try to standardize, you know, how, you know, things should be properly named going forward. I have a whole bunch of panelists, you know, and you know, right now they are online, and I'm wondering if any of you have either a comment regarding recycling, sustainability, you know, the subject that is on the table, you know, while we wait for either this speaker or the next speaker. Trying to collect questions right now. My Q&A is very dry this afternoon.
Well, anybody from a molder's perspective, right? If you think, let's talk about the resin identification codes, right? I mean, all they're really meant to do is to identify what the resin is. It's not meant to imply that the material can be recycled or is being recycled. But this is really a contentious issue, because if this rule change, if this nomenclature, if there's no teeth to it, there's no enforcement to it, you know, if you're a molder, are you going to go to the trouble and the expense to change over all of your molds to change your number one inside a chasing arrow to a number one inside a triangle? If you're not going to do it, is it simply cost? But if you are going to do it, should those costs be offset by passing them along to the converters or the consumers?
Hey, Conor, a question that coming from the audience right now, that what's going on with, you know, with all the plastics recycling. What about, you know, the practice of exporting all these plastic waste to China? Is that still going on? You know, how is that being reduced, curtailed, changed? What's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not on the front lines of that, but I mean, anytime you pick up an industry publication or something like resource recycling specifically, I mean, National Sword came down and essentially cut it all off, right? They reduced the levels of accepted impurities to what here in the West we considered unacceptable levels, right? So it was, you know, I think 0.5% or 1% contamination was allowed, and nobody was able to do that because the infrastructure to sort recyclables in this country is really, you know, 20, 30 years old, and is based on a very different waste stream. So there was a shift when people tried to get things to go to Malaysia, to Thailand, to Indonesia, but really it was a little bit of any port in a storm in terms of who would take it. And, you know, we don't need to go too deep into, you know, what we're seeing in the plastics wars, where customs officials in these countries are opening up 40-foot trailers and finding contaminated trash. And a lot of this is coming with labels from Western Europe and the United States. So it's really forced us to take a look here at what we should be doing. And there really is a lot of good work being done, but it's not necessarily in the public view either. A lot of MRFs, you know, material recycling facilities and the secondary MRFs and plastic recovering facilities, these guys are investing, they are stepping up, they are doing a lot of good work, but, you know, this is not visible to the public. It's not dramatic enough. You know, it's incremental change that isn't really setting the world on fire just yet. So at least in my opinion, it's forced a lot of changes. It's been an external force. And so now we're seeing what people are going to do with a combination of carrots and sticks and market-driven forces here.
For many people, the image, particularly from countries, you know, like, you know, Bangladesh or the Philippines, you know, where, you know, there is basically a ditch or an entire, you know, so you cannot even see the water, you know, you just see not only plastic, but garbage floating, and everything. So that image, of course, is, very negative to the plastics industry for what's going on. And, people advocating say, well, we got to pick it up. We got to do some collection, curbside collection. There's not even a curbside in these, countries in these, areas. And like Eve was saying, hey, it's the only way for these guys to get, drinking water is to get a bottle of water. So how do we contrast that with the fact that here in Princeton, New Jersey, my own house, I got to put out 4 different trash cans and one for paper, one for plastic, one for metal and all that. But the funny thing is when the trash car collector comes in, it puts them back together. Right. So I said, look, I just went through 15 days of sorting all this out and you're mixing it back together. So where do we start? By establishing a good example in the US as to how do we do curbside? Is that collapsing? Are we really in good shape in the US to do this? Or do we start in countries, that are, providing us with these pictures that people get all against plastics? Where do
I mean, it's multifaceted. It's complex. It's deep. The U.S. is a unique country in many, many ways, and a lot of people will compare us to Europe in terms of recycling rates or how they do things over there. But what we have to remember is that the U.S. is not a very densely populated country. There's an awful lot of space in this country. So when you think about rural communities spread all over the Midwest and other areas, it's not that easy to get a lot of collection systems set up because they're just not going to reach the critical mass that's required to allow anything to happen at scale. A curbside collection, I mean, there was a few stories a week or two ago about people in Atlanta in their curbside program being ticketed. They wouldn't pick up the garbage because people weren't separating the recyclables from the regular garbage. So I don't see a problem with that, frankly. I think if you're going to have a carrot, you're also going to have a stick. People might not like it. They might find it somewhat un-American or impinging on freedoms. But I mean, we're all in this together, right? I mean, if you take half an hour to separate it, if I separate it and it gets dumped back into a truck, then that's just redundant work. I mean, as engineers, that's just an inefficient system, right? Why separate first, recombine it, and then re-separate in a MRF? Curbside collection has its challenges too.
Well, one of the things that I hear the most is exactly what you're mentioning right now, packaging. I mean, we used to have packages for whatever it is, whether it's food or a drink or something. And there are all these many layers. Of course, as we were seeing in Eve Vitale's presentation, there is a reason why, a diaper has 3 layers or more. And there is a reason why packaging, whatever it is, it's got 2, 3 layers. It's being made by co-extrusion. It's being made by injection molding, but they're different materials. They all play a role. The problem we have is at the very end. Well, now you got a packaging that, this got 3 layers and they are incompatible for what we're going to do next with them. And so how do we separate? And so, you think for the folks that make packaging or they think about packaging now, there is a new driving force that says, we need to redesign this package, like Carrie was presenting this morning, that the entire package can be recycled, can be reused, that there are no issues with separation. To me, the biggest example is a PET bottle with a polypropylene cup, right? There's 2 very different materials. One is PET, the other one is a polyolefin. What are your thoughts on where it's, where do we move forward with packaging to answer this circular economy?
Well, I think again, if you look at some of what's happening in Europe, could be instructive here. Again, speaking generally, in Europe, there's a lot more regulation that comes from Brussels, from the Central European regulatory authorities. And again, it seems that those are taken on board by industry, even though I think in some cases they're not always applied evenly across all of the member states. But we have not been very open to EPR, for example, here, extended producer responsibility, even though some states are starting to look at it, because I think, with National Sword, with so many challenges in the act, there's no market solution, which is what we've been very good at in this country. But sometimes the market needs some guidance or a push. I mean, some people don't like thinking along those terms. But that's what EPR is. And in France, for example, they have what they call bonus malus schemes. So if your package is monomaterial or two compatible materials, or were both recyclable and easily separable, they will get bonus points, usually in the form of reduced taxation. And anything that's multi-layer or very difficult to work with will have a malus points and become more expensive. Mm-hmm. So really, I mean, if somebody's going to have to pay. In fact, everybody's going to have to pay somewhere along the lines. And whether it's by weight, like they do in Japan, or whether it's by bonus malus in France, some type of new innovative scheme is going to make its way into the plastics industry. And whether or not the industry chooses to help shape it, or work with other municipalities to help fund some of these programs, I think that's where we're going to be going. The question is just how actively do we do it versus how much do we wait to be hit with a regulatory stick.
Hey, Conor, a reminder first to the audience as to, you may be wondering what's going on, that, we're engaged on a conversation. Where is the speaker? Unfortunately, first speaker this afternoon is missing in action. We have not been able to, to locate this person, texted, call. So, we're filling in and we're commenting right now about the discussions and presentations we had this morning, as well as some of the questions you folks are providing on circular economy, recycling, and what's going on. This morning we saw Eastman promoting carbon neutrality as a driving force, and this question is coming from one of you in the audience. Can the plastics industry get behind that concept, Conor?
Carbon neutrality?
Yep.
I think an industry-driven, well, you should be careful on how we phrase it. There's a lot of engineers in the plastics industry. Engineers like data, they like models, things that can be explained mathematically. And I think when you read that, carbon neutrality is certainly as possible. And in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and measurements, it's certainly an admirable way to go. The challenge is that most people, if you can't see it, you can't conceive it. So the notion of taking cars off the road, even though people are trying to sort of, create something tangible and conceptual that the general public can understand and appreciate, there's an awful lot of proof showing that plastic bags, for example, are the greenest choice based on life cycle analysis, and therefore, the impact on carbon. Mm-hmm. It's just not holding water with people. It's just not. So, we can be right all we want, but if the market or the people don't accept it, then there's no point in losing but yet being right. So you think about the fishermen in the Philippines or in off the coast of West Africa. I mean, do they really think about carbon neutrality when they see plastic rubbish wash up on their beaches? No, they don't. They don't care. So what they see is the plastic. They don't. They're not necessarily thinking about the fishermen that dropped it there, or the fishing fleets at sea, that are dumping their nets overseas and have been doing for the last 50, 60 years. Those guys have problems, and, the industry needs to try and figure out how can we, address it, not just from, the mathematical conceptual life cycle analysis, but something more tangible that's going to affect people on the ground.
In a world that, what it is right now is 75% water. It's commonly said that we're going to have a water problem going forward. It seems that is the case, and recycling certainly uses a lot of water, right? So, any last comment? I believe our presenter, Cassie, is already online. Any last comment on that, Conor?
Well, we could have a whole conference on water as well. Just a quick anecdote from an investor called Jeremy Grantham. Some people might be familiar with. He's an English fellow, but he's based in Boston now. But I saw him speak a few years ago, and just one point that stuck out in terms of resource efficiency and resource use. When he was a child, there were 2 million people in Syria, and today there's something like 25 million. So you look at things like that in that part of the world where water is severely constrained to begin with, and I think we can all agree that the proper stewardship of water resources is certainly critical and should be considered when we think about recycling as well. So